We're talking about Keystone here, and I'm not sure we've had this talk yet, so I think we may have. I'm not sure. Let's go ahead and have it. What's the deal with Keystone? I guess the primary is over now, so it's you expect Clinton to flop on it? Actually, I don't. But let's take a step back, because I don't think that anything surrounding Keystone ever had anything to do with the environment, except the protests. Okay. If you look at who was in charge of the review process around the Keystone pipeline, you might expect it to be environmental agencies like the EPA. But if you look at it more carefully, the environmental agencies, they did their um, reports, and what was it they said? They said that if it was going to increase emissions, then they should cancel it. Or there was some logic that already made it clear that it wasn't going to happen. Or sorry, there was some logic that made it clear that it should happen. That was from the environmental agencies, right? And it was totally misinterpreted by the media. Um, but I mean, the environmental reviews were done like months before the reviews that actually were consequential. And those reviews came from military sources, the State Department, for example. So, the State Department doesn't do things lightly. When the State Department does a review, it's about national security. And so at the end of the day, the reason that Keystone was shelved was for national security reasons. What does that mean? Well, up here in Canada, um, Keystone's not the only way to get the oil out. Keystone was kind of the option that seemed to be preferred actually by our very powerful southern neighbors. But it wasn't the only option on the table. There was also an option out to BC. A couple of different options out to the Pacific coast actually. One of them moving into the U.S. very early, and out I think as far south as Oregon, and another one going up to the north of BC. Um, and the idea is that there would be tankers that would come, and that oil would be transported to Asia, which everybody knows means China, who in fact have large holdings in the tar sands in Canada. Um, a large amount of our oil is owned by the Chinese government. And what that means is that a large amount of the land is owned by the Chinese government, which was put in place entirely by our supposedly conservative prime minister. And with that came a very strange investment treaty, which we don't need to get into, but let's just point out that it screws us over pretty badly and we can't get out of it. That was the really weird part of it. The investment treaty with China, or the investment treaty that Canada signed with China, does not have an exit clause. And it's for a really long time. It almost seems like it's payback for Hong Kong or something. I don't know. But we didn't get anything out of it. Why would we sign that? Well, there's another option, of course, which is to try to ship the oil out across the country, all the way to New Brunswick, which is near Maine, um, and get it in tankers moving to Europe. um, who may need the oil if they get into a protracted conflict with Russia. Accidentally, on purpose, of course. Now, that means that, the Europe thing is an issue, but we'll get to that in a minute. What would the State Department think about exporting oil, or what would the State Department think about Canada exporting oil to China? Let's think about that for a minute. What does the State Department do? What has it done since 2003? In conjunction with the military and the various command centers that have been set up across the planet. What it largely does is control the supply of oil. And it can be pretty violent about it sometimes. You've got wars and coups, installations of dictatorships, all kinds of really nasty geopolitics around the supply of oil. And what is the major breakdown of that, if you look at it? You know? Seems like there's kind of two broad sets of interests. One which is connected to the former British Empire, including the United States. And the other which seems to have to do with the former communist space. Russia, China, and, well, there was a coup in Brazil fairly recently, wasn't there? Anyways, that's where the competition seems to be, is between these American, dominated bloc and the Chinese dominated bloc. Lots of competition, big competition in Africa for resources. For just one example. A couple of proxy wars running. What's the war in the Sudan about? It's a proxy war between the United States and China. It's about resources. So, that's just one example, right? It gets pretty complicated. Start talking about countries like Iran. The basic idea is that the Americans and Chinese don't get along too well when it comes to oil. They're pretty antagonistic about resources. And that's what the State Department does, is it ensures that America has primary access to resources, largely at the expense of the Chinese. And what is Canada? I always like to point this out because a lot of Americans don't know this. But there's actually a section in the Constitution of the United States that allows for the annexation of Canada. Only country in there. So, when we talk of spheres of influence, Canada is not just in the American sphere of influence, it's in the American Constitution. So, what would the State Department think of Canada shipping oil to China? Well, it's a sovereign country. It can make its own choices. Now let's look at those options with the pipelines. Is that a pipeline? If they send a pipeline from Alberta to the British Columbian coast, well, that's outside of American control. Meaning it would be hard, not impossible, barring some unforeseen shift in powers, it's not likely that the American Prime Minister, sorry, not likely that the Canadian Prime Minister would disobey orders to turn the oil off, right? But we're talking about the State Department here. They like to plan for unforeseen circumstances. And so the idea of having the oil flowing independently from Alberta to British Columbia outside of direct American control, they wouldn't like that. They might prefer the keystone. Because then that goes through their territory. And if the oil is connected through that infrastructure, it's not so easy to just turn it off and shift it the other way in case of an unforeseen circumstance. Now, as it happens to be, the pipeline from Alberta to British Columbia is cancelled. The British Columbian government will not allow for it on their level. There's also the fact that it would go through Indigenous territory, and Indigenous territory in British Columbia is complicated by the fact that they never signed any treaties. This is an entirely different branch of Canadian law that we don't need to get into right now. I'm sure we will get into this someday. But unlike most of Canada, where there was some sort of treaty signed, whether it was understood or whether it was broken or not, there was some terms of agreement that transferred sovereignty from the Indigenous peoples of the region to the British Empire, except in British Columbia. From a legal standpoint, the tribes in British Columbia were never conquered. There was never any treaties. That land is theirs from a legal standpoint. I mean, in a functional standpoint, we're there. We've got our helicopters flying over. We've got our flags planted. It's and the Indigenous people of the region acknowledge that, right? But there's no legal agreement. So if they say, we're not gonna, we don't want this here, our court is likely to give them quite a bit of discretion in that. And in fact, because our court is very liberal and very activist, conservatives say that negatively, I say quite positively. I think it's great that we have a very activist, very liberal court. If those cases find their way to higher levels in our court system, it's actually likely to lead to a reframing of the legal agreements. Right now, it's kind of in a legal limbo. There's a lot of cases that are kind of outstanding and whatnot, but there's huge gray areas because you have a de facto power that has no legal. From a legal standpoint, Canada is basically occupying British Columbia. It's an illegal occupation. So sending a pipeline through there without the cooperation of the people that live there is massively problematic. It's never going to happen. Or at least it's not going to happen in the near future. And not only is it not going to happen in the near future, but the court battles required to allow it to happen could have consequences that the ruling peoples at the various levels of government don't really want to see happen. Like I say, there are processes, and they'd rather have those processes play out as they're playing out than have a Supreme Court have to come in and make a ruling that could have consequences regarding the federal government's sovereignty over the region. So that gives the Americans some leverage regarding the Keystone, doesn't it? If they know that they can't get it out on that side, then that's their next choice. Well, hold on here. We're back to the State Department. What does the State Department think about Canada exporting oil to China? They don't really want them to. They might rather them go through the Keystone if they have a choice. If the choice is between, let them export it through BC or force them to export it through the Gulf, well, they'd rather them export it through the Gulf. Perhaps they might not want them to export it at all. Not to China, anyways. Well, what about to Europe? Of course, once the oil gets into the tanker in New Orleans, tanker by a sovereign country, America's no longer have control over that if it wants to go through the Panama Canal or that other canal that the Chinese are building near it. Who's to stop them from doing that? Might be better if they just cut them off altogether, right? But what if they go the other way? They go to New Brunswick. Something has happened in the last couple of years that was never true previously and that nobody really saw coming. The United States has returned as an exporter of oil. And what does that mean? That means that if the United States and Canada are both exporters of oil now, and they have a market for that oil in Europe, that means they're in competition. Uh-huh. And what does the American government think of competition? It doesn't like it so much. It prefers monopolies. It wants to dominate markets because that's what America is, right? Call it what you want, mercantilism, crony capitalism, choose your favorite pejoratives, but that's the way the system's run, right? So, why would they provide access for Canadian exports to China, of all places, that would be in competition with their own exports? So what did Clinton do here? Did she make an environmental decision? Well, she knew how to play the media well. She read the polls. She heard the opposition. But the policy was developed by the military for strategic purposes. And there's really little reason to think that her logic was in any way deviant from theirs.